There are some mistakes that pretty much every saltwater aquarist makes, many when you're new to the hobby, but also some more that crop up time and time again without you even realising. So today we're going to go over the top 7 mistakes that every reef keeper makes, and I want you to be honest as you go along and count up all of the mistakes you've made. The first mistake is assuming that all shrimp are good guys. The scarlet skunk cleaner shrimp is an absolute hobby icon and is one of the first animals you're likely to buy when you set up your first saltwater aquarium. And the good news is that they are totally peaceful and reef safe. The bad news though is that the same can't be said for many other shrimp in the hobby. Peppermint shrimp can be a great weapon against Aptasia anemones, as seen here, but they can also develop a taste for corals, and here is the exact same shrimp chowing down on my 150 pound torch coral while steadfastly ignoring the 15 pound green star polyp right behind him. I guess we'd all fly first class if someone else was paying. Camel shrimp are even worse because they look super cool but are even more likely to gobble down your favourite LPS corals. And other shrimp like boxer shrimp can even be aggressive towards the more docile shrimp in the hobby. Now most shrimp look totally innocent and harmless to the uninitiated, which is why this mistake traps so many of us. And the next mistake is an absolute classic: aiming flow straight at corals. Flow in a reef tank is one of the most important things to get right, and you will often see that many corals, especially SPS corals, require strong flow. But finding a consensus recommendation on where to place your power heads is a lot harder than you think. Many power heads only point straight ahead and can't be angled up or down. And in a nano tank where you don't have many options for power head placement, it's easy to end up blasting a coral to within an inch of its life. Now most corals will tolerate more flow than you might think, but putting any coral, even a flow-loving SPS coral, right in front of a power head will more than likely lead to it receding or even dying. So if you've been wondering why your first ever SPS coral is struggling despite your water parameters being on point, this may well be why. Related to that is the mistake of giving your corals too much light. Corals rely on photosynthesis for the overwhelming majority of their nutritional needs, so you'd be forgiven for thinking that if a little is good, more must be better. And when you first turn your new LED light on, your tank will look better the brighter you turn your lights up. But the reality is that even the most light-hungry corals like Aquapora don't need anywhere near as much light as you'd think, and I don't run the lights on any of my 3 tanks at over 65% intensity. You'd be amazed at how dim you can run your lights while still growing corals, and it's only the bright lights that seem so appealing to us that do damage. So next time you think a coral is suffering because it's not getting enough light, ask yourself instead if it could be getting too much light. The next mistake every reef keeper makes is buying too much filtration equipment. With live rock from the ocean becoming less and less popular, modern reef tanks have become more and more sterile, particularly in the first few months. And at the same time, it's easy to look at the sump of your favourite tank on Instagram, YouTube or forums and assume you need to cram your own sump full of filtration. But when you take a closer look, you might realise how little filtration is actually in that sump. In my 4-foot tank, for example, I have an automatic filter roller, a small skimmer, and a small phosphate reactor. That's it. Nothing else in this sump is for filtration, and that's for a tank I feed relatively heavily with dozens of established corals and numerous big fat fish. Now this trap catches so many of us because a lot of reef keepers are gear junkies, but a sterile, over-filtered tank will be at higher risk of hard-to-beat pests like dinoflagellates and cyanobacteria than a tank with high nitrate and phosphate. And you'll have more success with no filtration at all for the first few months than you would with too much filtration. And directly related to that is the mistake of overfeeding your tank. Feeding fish is pretty much the most fun part of the hobby, and you can even train some fish to eat out of the palm of your hand. But while you don't want your nitrate and phosphate levels bottoming out to 0, adding too much food, whether for fish or corals, is a recipe for algae. And overfeeding is really easily done, as there's no single answer that will help you find the perfect amount to feed your own tank. It depends on how many fish you have, what size they are, how many corals you have, what your filtration is, and many other factors. And the main reason so many of us fall into the trap of overfeeding is false test results. If you have a tank riddled with algae, that algae will soak up most or all of the excess nutrients in your water. So your test results will tell you your nutrients are too low, at which point you'll increase feeding, which will only make the problem worse. Saltwater aquariums can be a confusing hobby at times, and this is a classic example. The penultimate mistake every saltwater aquarist makes is looking for a complicated answer to a simple problem. The first question many people ask themselves when their corals are looking sad is, I wonder if it's my lights. This is then followed by tweaking the spectrum and intensity, maybe adding a little green because you heard someone say corals need green light, or going full on blue because you heard someone else say that blue light is best for corals. But the reality is that all that will do is piss the rest of your corals off. The secret behind the success of the top 5% of reef keepers in the hobby isn't because they've tuned the absolute perfect spectrum into their lights, it's not because they've mastered their trace elements, it's not that they dose phytoplankton, coral food or amino acids, and it's definitely not that they spend the most money on the latest reefing gadgets. Rather, the secret the top 5% follow is that they focus almost all of their energy on the basics. That means setting lights up correctly on day 1, then leaving them, adding sufficient flow, with more usually being better, using good quality source water, testing salinity, nitrate, phosphate and alkalinity regularly, and above all else, leaving the tank well alone. I would bet good money that over 95% of problems in any reef tank will be fixed by a combination of checking in on the basics and leaving the tank to settle for at least a month between making any changes. But sometimes the desire to fix a problem by just adding something from a bottle or buying a new piece of equipment is just too tempting to resist. And the number one mistake every reef keeper makes is buying a problem fish without researching first. And in fact, there are just two types of people in this hobby: those who've bought an inappropriate fish without first researching its care requirements, and liars. The worst culprits for this are cute little fish like dottybacks that look like they couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag, only to turn out to be an absolute Mike Tyson of a fish, or tiny juveniles that look like they won't grow more than a couple of inches at most, that actually turn out to be tank-busting monsters growing up to a foot long. And this is the most annoying mistake on this list because we all know we should do some research first, and we all know a quick Google search will prevent this problem happening. But sometimes it's just not possible to resist an impulse buy. Now I want you to be honest and tell me which of these mistakes you've made. I've personally made every single one of them, some several times. And if you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe for next time, and until then, happy reefing.